Hello, and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about world building, why it is such an important aspect of fantasy literature. We talk about it a lot, but quite often we think about it about just the fantastic elements that make the secondary world or the fantastic experience different, unique, and special. But world building in fantasy and world building in fiction in general is actually a fascinating topic. So I thought I would introduce this topic just as part of the general stuff I talk about in terms of narrative and address some of the aspects of it. And one of the first things to consider is world building as how the author constructs it. And I've spoken about this before. The author thinks about their story world and they create the elements of it that are going to build into their narrative. And that is part of the author's world building. And in a book set in, if you're writing a book today and you're writing about Victorian England, you do research about Victorian England, you do research about Victorian London, and you add in those elements to your narrative in order to evoke that world. You have to build the world of Victorian London, but a lot of it has already been done for you. A lot of it has already been captured. And even your readership, when they read it, will have certain preconceptions about what Victorian London was like. So you can build on that and you can either subvert it, you can correct it, you can play with it. Those things are done with you because there's a cultural knowledge about it. But when you are creating a fantasy world, you have to then think about the elements of that fantasy world that are essential to be narrated to your narratee, to your reader. And this gets to the heart of about what we can do with world building and different ways to understand it, because it's not any one thing. It's the elements that are narrated to us that help us as readers create a picture of the physical setting or the metaphysical setting of the narrative. That's an aspect of world building. So it's tied very directly into aspects of narration, style of narration, point of view. So world building is not a distinct entity that exists on its own that you can examine without considering how it has been communicated. And that is point of view, style of narration, the prose that's being used, the language that's being used. All of those tie into and are inextricably linked to world building. So while we talk about it separately, it is absolutely connected to these other things. And the next thing to think about world building, if the novel is a standalone, if it is a book one, if it is book one of a trilogy, if it's book one of 5 or 7 or a continuing series, if it is mid-series or mid-trilogy or mid-narrative in multiple volumes, all of those things, again, have an impact on world building. So what I mean by this is if a book, a novel is intended to be a standalone. So let's say for the sake of argument, I'm going to write a fantasy novel and it is a standalone. There is no intention to ever return to this world. Then the elements of the world building that are used are only those that are important to the narrative being told and give a sense of flavor and style and uniqueness to that setting, that serve the project of telling that one story, of evoking that one narrative. Because in a standalone, you are not considering building out an entire setting. A lot of those things are extraneous. You don't need them. They're not necessary. You still add in elements that give it flavor, that give it color, that give it texture. That's an essential part of evoking the story world, of evoking the setting. And if it is a secondary world fantasy, those elements have to be present. You have to have considered them somewhere in the back of your mind. But if it's a secondary world fantasy and you're only writing a standalone in it, then You don't need to know what all the different continents are and what the trade routes are and all of that sort of stuff. That's not necessary. And in fact, including those aspects rather than adding to the richness of the world could end up very much detracting from your narrative project. If it is a standalone that is in fairy, then of course, then you're thinking about it in a very different way. The world building can be extremely whimsical. It can have an element of dream to it. It doesn't have to make sense the same way that a secondary world does. And this is where I think when we have conversations about world building, we think about world building very much in the format of secondary world creation and not necessarily the evocation of a story world that is appropriate to the narrative that is being told. Because world building is not, even though it's called world building, it's not necessarily about creating a world, a physical reality. It is about creating a story world. And what is necessary in a story world is entirely dependent on what the narrative is doing. So when we talk about the creation of fairy realms or magical realms or these metaphysical realms or these dream realms, one of the fascinating things about those is they break a lot of the rules of world building that we think of when we think of secondary worlds. To give you an example of this, when we think of the Hyborian age, a lot of the Conan stories, so Robert E. Howard's Conan series, the map of the Hyborian era, as it was initially constructed, was a bit like the map of the Forgotten Realms. You had rivers that were running the wrong way according to the topography of the map. You had jungle settings running into here's a jungle, and it was like a rainforest type jungle, and it ended, and then there was just desert. There was no transition between jungle and desert. Or here's a glacier, and then suddenly it's running into something else. That the geographical spaces that were represented on the map were essentially discontiguous narrative spaces. Discontiguous in that they were enclosed sort of polders or story realms where this is the landscape that I need for this story, and to the south is this thing, and there is no point of geographical transition between them that makes sense in the way that we would have, say, on a planet. But when we consider realms like fairy, if it is metaphysical or if it is a magical realm or a supernatural realm, does not need to conform to those same things where you go, this forest has to transition into savanna and grassland, or scrubland into grassland, and then from there transition into desert. And you don't need to do that because you can have discontiguous narrative spaces. These spaces do not need to line up. And that is not a failure in the world building. It is a recognition that the world building can change. What is necessary for the world building can change depending on the narrative type. And then when we think of a story that is meant to be set in a dreamlike realm where these characters are interacting and it's a very character focused story, then the world building can be incredibly minimal. And that is not necessarily a detriment to the story, because if the story is heavily focused, if the narrative is heavily focused on whatever these characters are going through and revealing that aspect, then the world building is just a narrative backdrop to it. It decreases in importance. And one of the other interesting aspects about a lot of these story worlds is the use of the physical settings or the metaphysical settings as being linked to a sort of psychogeography, where there is a link between the type of landscape and linking it to the characteristics of the people that live there and the language that they have. So there's a brutal glacier-ridden wasteland to the north, and the people there are hardy and hard, and their language is harsh and guttural because the landscape is guttural, or the landscape is harsh, and the weather is harsh, and everything is closed and clipped off because it's about minimizing the amount of time that you would need to be speaking. Whereas in a beautiful, relaxed, sunlit, dappled landscape of soft grasses and fruit trees, we might have a much more languid culture where the language itself could be languid. The characters could be more laid back, where everything is more relaxed because the landscape is so gentle. And so you can link the landscape to the characters or the culture that lives there, and that can be reflected in their language. And when we have language and culture and landscape being connected in these ways, and this byplay between them, that is when world building truly is integrated into the narrative. And it doesn't always have to be this way, but that is one of the techniques. And we can see this in Guy Gavriel Kay does it with some of his writing, where we can see that romance landscape and the romance language, and it's reflected in the romance and poetry of his prose. They are all connected. But when we see, say, in other writings by other authors, the idea of the harsh, brutal truth of the sort of nomadic Viking-esque tribes living in these harsh shores. Again, we're seeing this connection between the landscape and the language and the culture and the people. And that is one way to have all of this integrated. Is it always necessary? No, it's not always necessary. But it's not a demerit if someone doesn't do it. But it can be an exceptional strength when an author has thought these things through. And another aspect of it is, and I mentioned this at the beginning, the world building, depending on whether it's a standalone or if it's in a series, if something is to be an enclosed narrative system, so a standalone is a very short story would be the shortest of the enclosed narrative systems. Then you can have a standalone novel, which again would be an enclosed narrative system. A trilogy is an enclosed narrative system that you expect that short stories, novels, or a trilogy, there will be a narrative structure of some sort employed across them. Not necessarily the Freytag's pyramid. It may be a different narrative structure that's being used, but a narrative structure of some kind, because it is an enclosed narrative, is a finished narrative. There should be an element of closure at the end, depending on how the ending is meant to feel to the reader. But when we think of those, when we think of the world building involved in that, the more expansive the world the story is inhabiting, or the longer the narrative, the more room you have to bring in these details. Now, you can have a trilogy in which it is all happening in one fantasy city in one land. But if you drop in, and you have space to drop in a trilogy, references to other lands, other cultures, you can have characters from other cultures turn up in that city. You don't need to fully flesh those things out. That may never have entered into the author's mind. But those are elements that create a sense of the broader world. And I've spoken about this before, about the iceberg storytelling method. The author drops in these references to these far off places or these different places, and it allows the reader, the narratee, to imagine this whole other world that is out there beyond the walls of the city. But within a trilogy, because typically trilogies have this additional space that you can use, you can have characters move around, you can include other elements that build this world out further. So things that that you didn't necessarily need in a short story version set in this world, or things that you didn't need in a standalone set in this world, in a trilogy, you may have to include elements to show the wider world. Otherwise, you run the risk potentially of the setting that you have for the trilogy feeling like it is a well-developed, beautiful city that is sitting in a white narrative void because the rest of the world doesn't exist. And when you do that, the artificiality of the narrative can be emphasized. Is this always the case? No, it's not always the case. It depends on the type of narrative. But when we move into the idea of a series, so an urban fantasy series that's ongoing, or a fantasy series that's ongoing, if we think of Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, even Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, or worlds that were created, Raymond E. Feist's whole Midkemia and Kellowan settings, what happens there is the setting itself becomes a reusable setting for the story world. And of course, we see this initially in Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, Conan goes on these travels across various lands, and each time a new land gets developed, a new narrative setting has been developed and incorporated into the story world. But if those things are not integrated into the story world, we run into that issue of Conan's Hyborian age has discontiguous narrative spaces which don't seem to match up necessarily to our conception of it as a reusable setting, as a reusable secondary world. It comes across very much as these disparate, non-connected narrative spaces that Conan has an adventure in and then moves to another one, and we just know it's somewhere to the east or somewhere to the west. But when we think of, say, Farron in the Forgotten Realms, that's the whole idea of having a reusable setting. And as the different series and books explore different aspects, the world gets filled in greater and greater depth and detail. But once you have that level of complexity, this is when integration becomes harder to maintain, because think of the complexity of our own world. You can have a story set in Ireland, but the characters in Ireland moving around, they're not all going to be Irish. There'll be people from the UK, people from America, people from China, people from various countries in Africa, people from other European countries. There'll be people from all over the world who will move in and out of a story set in modern day Ireland. When we have reusable settings, again, there are different ways that the author can approach the world building. One is you start small and slowly expand and expand and expand. And that fits with a narrative trajectory of something that we see very commonly in portal quests and that we see in portal fantasies, quest fantasies, where the characters explore new realms each time. So what I referred to in the Hyborian era, where the new Conan story is in a new setting to provide a new and improved experience for the reader, something exciting and different to read. It's not just the same old thing all the time. We can see that in an ongoing series. But in an ongoing series, these things have to be integrated into the original. And this is where we see a more nebulous world building at the beginning that is only essential for what's being told there, allows for this expansion. And as long as the expansion is organic and connected to the philosophy of the beginning, it can feel like, as we are reading, oh, the author must have always imagined all of this, when quite likely the author did not imagine all of that. They have built organically from that point. They have included a new setting, but they know the feel of their world. And so as it's brought in, they might pick up on a very tiny detail that was just an aside in the book 1 or book 2. And now they're going to expand on it and create a whole culture. But because part of it was dropped in book 1 or book 2, when this whole culture is explored in book 7, it feels like it was always there. So when you reread, knowing that that stuff is in book 7 and you're familiar with the stuff in book 7, when you read that dropped in hint or that little breadcrumb that they inserted as a bit of flavor, a bit of color, it suddenly has enormous resonance. And this is one of the fascinating things about the construction of world building in terms of fantasy, that quite often when you go back and reread, it creates more of this iceberg underneath. The difficulty is when we have that sort of retconning, when something is mentioned in book 1, and now that the author has gotten to something and they're exploring it, they go, I've had a brilliant idea about how to do this, and I'm going to go off on this. And they have forgotten that there was a breadcrumb earlier on about it. And what they explore is very, very different. And that can feel jarring, because now we've moved from what felt like an organic, contiguous building out into a systemic and connected secondary world or secondary story world. Now feels like a discontiguous narrative space, and it can be jarring. Now, that again is dependent on the type of narrative, because we can have unreliable narration where the narrator was mistaken about the earlier element and now is learning about it. We can have characters who are ignorant of the world, and when they move out on their quest, when they move out on their journey and explore it, they can have their misconceptions corrected, which gives the reader this insight into everything that's going on. These techniques can be played with by authors. But again, world building is a complex thing that is both what the author initially conceives and creates, what they create over time, particularly with an evolving series, but it's also the process through which it's communicated to us, and it is the process through which we imagine the world. All of these are different aspects of world building. So when we address world building, when we're discussing books, when we're reviewing books, when we're talking about these things, and we say world building, and we separate it out from this, quite often we forget that how we're interpreting it, what we are fixated on, or what we want to discuss about it, is intricately and intimately connected to point of view, character knowledge, style of narration, and actually the style of narrative, what is being told and why it's being told that way. And so when we think of world building as an isolated element, quite often it's a lot more complicated than that. And there are lots of different ways to do it depending on, and this is where we get into the intention of the author or the style of book. When an author writes let's take the example of a modern day variant of a myth, and they transpose the myth into a different time period. Are they trying to accurately represent that time period? Not necessarily. It's not historical fiction, it's fantasy. And historical fiction and fantasy are different. They share a lot of similarities, obviously. But when an author is telling a myth and they have transposed a myth from the accepted time period of that myth and they have moved it into a different time period, they are already breaking temporal logic, the chronology. Things are going to be different. And if it involves aspects of magic or fantasy worlds or fairy tales, then what we can have there is, this is not meant to be our time period. This is a fantasy variant of our time period, and it'll share similarities, but it could be radically different. And we can see this in a subgenre, something like steampunk. Something like steampunk is very explicitly breaking the rules of our own history to create this new narrative. And they have levels of technology that did not exist in the Victorian time period, but it is recognizably the Victorian time period. So when we have a story that purports to be set, say, in the Victorian time period, or in Edwardian, or in whatever, we can become locked into the idea that that is real, that is meant to be the real. And we forget that the entire thing is a fantasy, and in fact, may be being played with by the author. So when we think about world building, veracity, cohesion, authenticity, elements that are historically true, and elements that are anachronistic, all of these things can trip us up and become issues, particularly when we look at them outside of the context of the entire narrative. But when we integrate it into a consideration of, well, the narrative is a fantasy, and when the narrative is doing this, it's playing around with concepts of these things. And also, it is a modern retelling. It's being written in the modern day, and it has to be relatable to the modern audience in some way, that there are going to be levels of translation and levels of alteration to what the historical time period is. And all of this has to do with how well authorial intent comes across in the world building. But all of this is simply to say, world building is a fascinating topic, and it has a lot of nuance to it that can play into other aspects of characterization and all of the other narrative elements that I typically talk about. And so I'm probably going to do another couple of videos on different aspects of world building, because I think it is a lot of fun. And I think it is one of those issues, particularly about fantasy, that we love to discuss. But so frequently we talk about the magic system, or we talk about the element of the world building that makes it fantastic. And we forget about all of the other world building that goes on. So Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.